copy of a foreign piece, a letter to my unborn child. There were many who came before you, who decided that the world they were born into was not going to be the one they would die in. Ones who dared to dream of another future and woke up every day to realize those dreams. They didn't need to be told that their dreams were valid. I pray that this is the world you will be born into, one in which you're able to chart your own course without seeking the permission of others. I pray that you will not know of days when our bodies were fragmented, compartmentalized along with our identities, when the dignity, integrity, and autonomy of our bodies which house us was up for negotiation. I pray that you will not know of violence, abuse, discrimination at the hands of those meant to protect you, your parents, teachers, partner, police, or employers, and perhaps worst of all, by the society at large, condemning your very birth and gender. I pray that FGM, child and forced marriages, rape, widow inheritance, breast ironing, honor killings will be foreign words to you, a taboo to the entire community, that the only culture you know will put your safety and well-being above all else. I pray that you will not know of a time when bullets were more readily available than bread, when profits came before people, when industries were mined on our backs, when our own drowned in foreign shores searching for a life worth living. I pray that your realities will only be peppered by the understanding that those before you overcame the most horrendous of sufferings. I pray, my unborn child, that you will only know days when those who used to be at the margins of our societies are now at its center, where gender parity and equality are not simply principles in an idealist conversation, but rather your daily lived reality, where you have an equal say, share, and control of the resources this continent has to offer, where your voice and your choice may be questioned, but never threatened, where we care for the earth and the sustenance it births, where your chances of becoming the next CEO, president, pilot, scientist, engineer, media owner is equal to that of your brother, where the guns will be silenced, where justice and peace are simply the constant and consistent state of affairs, where all people everywhere will be treated with the dignity and respect they deserve and were born entitled to. And I pray, my little sweet one, that as I end this letter and read it to others, that they won't dismiss it as the rantings of a mad idealist who dreams of an impossible utopia. I pray they will wake up from their stupor, wake into a state of consciousness that makes them realize we can and we must refuse to accept things as they are. We must be mad and dare to invent the future. Another reality is not only possible, it is necessary. After all, we are reminded Africa is still waiting for its makers to remake it, and we are the ones we've been waiting for. Together, we'll create that world for you and for those who come after you. And when that day comes, my unborn child, I cannot wait to welcome you into it. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I want to start by acknowledging the chair to the Bureau of the 9th Regional Conference on Beijing+20, the Honorable Patricia Kaliati, Minister of the Ministry of Gender, Children, Disability, and Social Welfare of Malawi. Madam, thank you. Honorable ministers here present, Madame Gertrude Mongela, who led the Beijing process in 1995, Ms. Lakshmi Puri, UN Women Executive Director and Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, Ms. Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi, Special Envoy on Gender at the African Development Bank. Her Excellency Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, AUC Chairperson, who is represented here by her Special Assistant. His Excellency Dr. Carlos Lopez, United Nations Under-Secretary General and Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, development partners here present, colleagues from the UN family, distinguished delegates, civil society organizations here present, and experts, ladies and gentlemen. First, let me start by thanking Ms. Nabila Abdul Malik from Femnet for that wonderful poem, and also for showing us that if the 12 critical areas of concern are implemented, the coming generations will not know discrimination, violence, female genital mutilation, and poverty, and further, that women and girls will enjoy the benefits of the economic growth and social development of their countries. Can we give her another round of applause? Distinguished delegates, before I invite members of the honorable and distinguished high table, I would like to acknowledge the excellent work that the experts have done in the last 2 days, which has culminated in the rich declaration that the ministers will be reviewing and adopting today. Members of the high table, civil society has consulted in 2 separate sessions. The first from 21st to 22nd October here in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and the second over the weekend, just on the eve of the regional conference. As we know, civil society remains the voice that reminds us of what we might be overlooking, especially in relation to poor and rural communities. Distinguished delegates, it is now my pleasure to invite Madame Lakshmi Puri to make her remarks. Ms. Puri is the UN Assistant Secretary General and UN Women Deputy Executive Director. And as we know, UN Women is leading the global review of the Beijing Platform for Action, which will take place in March 2015 in New York. Ms. Puri, I invite you to make your remarks.
Good morning. Distinguished Minister of Malawi, the Chair of the Bureau, distinguished Ministers of Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment, and our strongest allies and actors and central actors in the Gender Equality and Women Empowerment project in Africa, civil society, veteran leaders, as well as the young women leaders who have joined us here. Dr. Carlos Lopez, the leader in ECA, who has driven a strong partnership but also leadership on gender equality and women's empowerment issues. Dr. Zuma, whom I know is going to be with us, is here in spirit and is always driving African Union to advance gender equality and women's empowerment agenda in a pan-African but also in specific sectors and areas. And of course we have in the form of Geraldine and her presence and her leadership in the African Development Bank, a strong ally to drive greater investment, necessary investment in gender equality and women's empowerment. I pay a tribute to all of you and all of the others who are part of this, what we consider, but not parochially so, the biggest project for humanity in the 21st century. We are also, dear friends, at a historic conjunction. We are in African terms, but also in global terms. And I'm here to also put those things out there in terms of what's happening globally, because you already know what's happening in Africa and why this is such an important conjunction, both 2014 and 2015. One, that we are now building up to constructing the first ever comprehensive, transformative development agenda for all. It's a universal development agenda which is being developed. Sustainable development agenda covering economic, social, and environmental dimensions in the form of the post-2015 development framework and the Sustainable Development Goals. Secondly, we are also undertaking, and many in the expert meetings leading up to this ministerial segment have emphasized the peace and security aspect, because gender equality has a sustainable dimension in all three respects, but also a very important peace and security dimension. And we are undertaking a global review of marking the 15th anniversary of 1325, Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security, and asking why there has been inadequate implementation of 1325 and all the other resolutions since. So that agenda is also being now looked at for further implementation. Also, we have other processes, but which all of you know about, the climate change agreement and other agreements going forward. Also, why is Africa so important? And why we at UN Women attach the highest priority to this regional review? And not only because Dr. Pumzile is our leader, but even otherwise, we consider Africa to be one of the most important theaters for the working out of the Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment Project. So what you do, what you achieve, what challenges you face are integral to the global project. And not only integral, I think without that, we are not going to get any advance globally. Now, 20 years ago, Africa played a key role, and we have with us Mama Mongela, Mama Beijing, as she is affectionately called, where African women's organizations and African government leaders like her played a critical role in putting together the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, which is a visionary landmark agenda for gender equality and women's empowerment and women's rights. Please do not ever forget that aspect of women's rights that was affirmed at Beijing. Women's rights are human rights, and human rights are women's rights. So that aspect we must never forget and keep affirming, because sometimes that tends to get clouded over by other expediencies. Second, it was also very, very a pioneering document in terms of getting or setting strategic objectives and concrete actions, areas as relevant today as they were 20 years ago. And not only because we haven't implemented a lot of it, but also because these are issues that are perennially important. And also, it was ahead of the times. It had many practical actions that were affirmed there. And it has become, therefore, a gold standard. And 20 years on, instead of having a fifth world conference to negotiate a whole new document, what we are doing is to see, and this is what I want to affirm, to see how we can accelerate and make more effective the implementation of the Beijing Platform for Action. And that's what you do when you review and appraise the implementation, you commemorate, and you drive as well, not only political mobilization at the highest level, and recommitment and political will, and you represent that, but you also drive it with the heads of states, with the other ministries in government. And at the same time, this whole issue of gender mainstreaming, gender-responsive budgeting, investment in gender equality, all of that. And of course, I would like to congratulate Africa, because you have been exemplary in the national reports that you have produced. And of course, credit also equally goes to our partners, the ECA. We have been working together at the national level and at the regional level to make sure that Africa takes stock of progress and reports on it. So we have 51 out of 54 countries, African countries, who have presented the reports. So I would like to congratulate you on that. So at this regional review, what we will need to really do is to seek to identify critical accelerators, game changers, force multipliers in terms of sectors, new and emerging issues, instruments, institutions, investments, and I can only mention some of them very, very briefly. Youth. Africa is a youthful continent. And unless we engage youth, young women, but also, of course, the agency of young men, but first of all, build the agency of young women, we can't get anywhere on implementation of Beijing. Men and boys, the engagement, involvement, and taking the responsibility of men and boys can be a game changer and should be. And it was in Beijing, but it was not implemented. Innovation, social innovation, economic innovation, governance innovation, so that we can reach our targets. And of course, technology. Technologies that change the way women's lived realities can be influenced and affected and positively moved. And of course, we are talking about game changers in terms of governments themselves becoming leaders in this area, but also private sector and civil society, because we don't also want that women's movement is a kind of, it lives and works in a separate compartment, whilst the rest of the civil society, the development civil society, the environment, the human rights civil society. So every part of the civil society space and agency must take responsibility for gender equality and women's empowerment agenda. This is what we need to push. And of course, investment, investment, investment. And I hope we will hear something from the African Development Bank, from African Union and others about how we can really drive more investment into the implementation of the 12 critical areas. Now, Africa is also critical because you are facing unprecedented challenges today. as much as, of course, I'm going to talk about the progress, you are going through multiple crises. Apart from the endemic poverty, conflict, patriarchy of its own brand, structural barriers, traditional and harmful and cultural practices that are against gender equality and women's rights and that compound violence against women, all of these, and natural disasters, all of these crises. And women are, and not to mention the Ebola epidemic and how women are both disproportionately affected by all of these, but also how their agency can provide the biggest solution and be a game changer. Now, there are many things. This is also about celebrating progress. Of course, there has been progress. Many more women and girls have grown out of poverty, the maternal mortality rates have gone down, literacy and education has increased, participation in workforce and in the economy has increased, access to sexual and reproductive health services has increased, and rights, also recognition of rights has increased. Participation in power and decision-making in public life, in entrepreneurship, in the private sector has increased. Gender mainstreaming, I already mentioned. Women's human rights recognition, peace and security and their role. And most of all, I would like to commend Africa for having the most comprehensive set of regional normative frameworks and agendas, including, of course, the decade being, this decade from 2013 to 2023 being declared the Women's Decade, next year being declared the Women's Year. All of that focus, that kind of normative standards and frameworks and commitments, this is positive, and we celebrate that. But let me also say that it's not enough, and it's not moving the needle fast enough, because there are, of course, globally, and Africa contributes to that, and I'm sure in our report we have this indication. If we don't do something drastic, something really transformative, we are not going to meet any of the targets, the objectives set in Beijing, or we didn't meet the MDGs, and we are not going to meet even the SDGs, even by the end of the century, let alone 2063. Because in none of the critical areas, there has been a critical mass of progress. And majority are poor, majority of women and girls are poor, illiterate, lacking access to health and SRHR-related rights and other human rights. Violence against women is a pandemic, and of course, their participation in the workforce is limited to vulnerable and informal sector employment. And of course, their participation in political life is still a big struggle, despite the great progress in some of the exemplar countries like Rwanda and Liberia, and Senegal, and some of the other countries. And there they are still laboring under a huge burden of unpaid care work, which is unvalued, which is not distributed, and social protection continues to be inadequate. So in all of these areas, we therefore have big challenges to overcome. And this is a time when, through your voice, through your consultation, and through your reflection, you give a strong message to yourselves, of course, and to the governments here, to the regional organizations, but also to the international community about what these critical game changers, force multipliers are, what needs to be done. And I know that for many of us, including people, Beijing veterans like Mama Mongela, Beijing platform is like a baby. And now, 20 years later, we want to see that the dream, it was a dream, an aspiration, but also very concrete things. We want to see 20 years later how that dream gets realized. And we heard in the poem that was recited at the beginning that a whole new generation is having its own dreams based on Beijing. So we now need to join forces, governments, civil society, private sector, the Beijing generation, and of course we favor the life cycle approach on gender equality and women's empowerment. But also we need to create, you know, in Ethiopia here you have, what is it called? It's called the Army of Development. So we need to create an army of young women who really buy into and also lead this agenda. And that is African women's greatest hope. That coming together, joining our forces, and young women becoming agents of and leaders in this great project. I wish you all the very best and bring Madame Pumzile Mlambo Nguka's warm greetings. She would very much have liked to be here. And I also want to assure our full cooperation with all of you at the national level, at the global level, and of course at the regional level. And I want to also add, I want to pay a special tribute to the African women's movement, who have not only played a role at the grassroots level, that has been their strength, but at the national level, at the regional level, and also at the global. They have been a big inspiration at the global level. So thank you very much.
Can we have another round of applause for Madam Puri? In a very impassioned address, she has reminded us about Africa's importance for the global gender equality agenda. She has also reasserted the Beijing Platform for Action as the gold standard and called for recommitment and political will to accelerate progress. While she has celebrated the achievements, she has also not minced words that what we have done so far is not enough, that we need critical accelerators, we need game changers, we need to engage the youth, we need to build the agency of young women, involve boys and women and men, We need innovations in governance, in the social sector. We need to use technology more to empower women and young girls, and that the business of gender equality is everybody else's business. It is not only the business of women, it is not just the business of civil society. We need the private sector. We also need critical investments to drive the implementation of the 12 critical areas, so that by 2063, at the very latest, we will begin to see tangible progress in all the critical areas that we have committed to. Thank you very much, Madam Puri. And it is now my pleasure to invite Ms. Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi, Special Envoy on Gender at the Africa Development Bank. And I'd like to remind you that Ms. Moleketi was Director of the United Nations Development Program's Democratic Governance Group and has also held ministerial positions in the South African government. Thank you.
Thank you. It's fine. Good morning. It's a great honor for me to be here with you this morning. And in recognizing that honor, I want to take you back in time In 1995, I was the deputy leader of the South African delegation to Beijing. And the delegation at that point was led by Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, who's now the chair of the AUC. So I think it's no accident or coincidence that this time we come together to reflect on the 20-year road, but to also look forward to the road ahead, because there's been much achieved, but there's even more to be done. And it's being done with an African woman at the helm of the African Union Commission. And we need to use this opportunity to make a difference and to make the prayer we heard this morning a reality for each and every African woman, each and every African girl, each and every African child, each and every African man and woman. And for every African, there must be a difference. And that difference is within a global setting. Because at the end of the day, we must be part of that difference. So I'd want to recognize at this point Ms. Lakshmi Puri, the UN Women Deputy Executive Director. I'd also want to recognize His Excellency Dr. Carlos Lopez. I want to recognize Ambassador Phoebe Potgieter, who's standing in big shoes for Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, the AUC chairperson, and then, of course, the chair of the conference, Honorable Minister Patricia, and I don't want to mispronounce your surname, so I'll say, Honorable Sister, it's good to have you here as chairing this bureau. But in that recognition, it would be remiss if we don't recognize Mama Gertrude Mongela. She, after all, chaired Beijing. She was the Secretary General at that point in time. Because as we gather together, we gather because we believe that Africa is at a tipping point. And all of us who have the privilege of being in this room must ensure that when we leave this meeting, the Addis Ababa Declaration on accelerating the implementation of the Beijing Platform of Action towards transformational change for women and girls will not be a dream, because we have the obligation, we have the responsibility of making this a reality. We have to do it because we are carrying it for all those who are not in this august room, not at this occasion. I come here with the words of Dr. Donald Kaberuka, the president of the African Development Bank, Africa's Development Bank. And his words is that gender is not an annex. And I close quotes. Because it is no annex. And unless there's real change that takes this into account, the 2 decades since Beijing will be seen as a short journey and as a long journey, because the journey ahead will even be longer. And the narrative of Africa over the recent decades, and in particular the past decade, has been one of great optimism and great prospects. And we've heard the image of Africa rising, and there's been questions around this, because in many instances we've also asked the question, has Africa and is Africa rising with all its citizens? Are all the citizens and peoples of Africa rising together? Are we ensuring that Africa's prosperity and growth story, inclusive growth, is indeed inclusive? So yes, we note that the tide is turning, but we are not at the tipping point yet. And you and I need to ensure that we hit that tipping point. We know that gender inequalities are still pervasive in many sectors. And we also know that women have been active participants to a degree because their full potential has not been realized to contribute towards this change. But we want to ensure that we are not passive onlookers, but that we are active drivers of this change to ensure that we reach the tipping point. So what has to be done? And we know that this has been a question that has been there in the classics, and it's not new asking this question. So I'm going to throw out some issues, and we'll also throw it out later. And I build this on what has been raised through the prayer that was presented to us this morning. And I'm not going to repeat that prayer because it was presented so graphically that it's ingrained in our thinking right now. But that prayer includes the rights of women. And as Lakshmi Puri has said and spelled out from a global frame, this is a given. We need to look at it. So let's look at what else is required. And we know since the 1994 5th Regional Conference on Women that was held in Dakar, Senegal. And there are many of us in this room who were in Senegal when we drew up the Africa platform at that point in time, when African governments carried their regional perspectives to Beijing, which was captured and reflected in the platform for action. African countries had compiled their own reports on the follow-up conferences that monitored progress in the implementation of the platform of action. The question could be asked, and this question could be asked intergenerationally. Did all of us monitor the progress as closely as we should have? Did all of us ensure the accountability required from all sectors of society as required? Accountability by heads of state and governments, accountability by your development bank on the continent, accountability by civil society, and accountability by the private sector. And I would say not quite. I'd say we expected someone else to do it. We thought that ours was simply to monitor. Remember, watchdogs, as stated, are the ones that are chained. They watch and see that the thief does not get in, and when it gets in, barks and tries to capture it. We are not watchdogs. We are participants and activists in change. So let's say we did not ensure the accountability required from all sectors of society. And we can do more. A second issue that one would want to raise, and that's that in response in June 2000, during the 23rd extraordinary session of the General Assembly, the African Development Bank made a statement confirming the bank's support to the Beijing Platform of Action and its implementation, and stated that we made recent policy changes and operational approaches that would be included through the work of the bank and its projects. It also went on, as per request of the member countries, it went on to put in place a special fund for women, a small fund called the African Women in Business. Now, I want to say today that that fund was only had $10 million in it. When we look at the enormity of the challenges on the African continent, that is but a drop in the ocean. 54 member countries, $10 million, how do you slice the cake? And you can try in any direction, but there's nothing that will reach tipping point. So as we gather here, and as we talk about a need for an engagement, and as we talk about a story whose ending is still being written, and this is the story of women and girls, the 50% plus that must be part of the change required, we also need to ensure that this story is accompanied by the resources required. And Africa is rallying because, as was mentioned earlier, we've been hit with shocks such as Ebola. And we stand ready to make sure that women who are facing this at this very moment, we're also looking at, as the bank, at the socio-economic implications of Ebola on women in order to ensure that women are able to rebuild their livelihoods now, during, and after. So as Dr. Carlos Lopez, Dr. Donald Kaberuka, and Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma had met with the private sector and business, who made an original pledge of $28 million to the Ebola cause, and looked at harnessing the private sectors, especially the mobile operators, to ensure that there will be $1 from users of mobile operators. And if we look at the biggest figure, $300 million, is it, Carlos, potentially coming in? I'm saying for the women of Africa, as this Ebola scourge is dealt with, remember there's a bigger agenda, an agenda that says there's a need for fundamental change to engage women on the continent. And to that end, we only need 10% of the $300 million as a start to make a real difference. And 10% is a small priority, a small amount. And that 10% must go with even more as we take that agenda forward. Further issues to consider, and this I want to address to the ministers of gender and women affairs who are present and those who could not make it today. There's a need for these ministers to ensure that they influence key drivers of growth. They should ensure that the sectors, they must identify, and it's been identified, they must determine that the sectors that drive economic growth on the African continent, such as the construction sector, such as extractives, the infrastructure, and so on, we must look at where the huge investments are, where the high returns are. You should follow the money, and you must ensure that more is done for women's participation and engagement in these sectors. They must benefit from it. And the day we begin to see a critical number of women investors, winning and implementing large infrastructure, energy, and drilling projects, then we can say we're reaching the tipping point. But it's not just for the few, it's also looking at job creation in a big way. So there's a need for gender ministers to act differently. There's a need to be positioned strategically in order to catalyze, influence, and monitor the work done. Because ministers of gender are not sectoral ministers, but you need to be at the center of the sectoral ministries and at the center of government. You must limit your focus from looking at small projects. We need to go big. We need scale and we need impact. If we don't do that, it will not happen. So catalyze the change and let the expert sectors implement. Gender ministries are not implementation ministries. Yours is to catalyze and get the sectoral ministries to implement. So let's not talk about the budget size of the gender ministries. At the end of the day, these ministries and ministers should be seen as the third or fourth most important in government. And if you're not making a difference. It will not happen, and we need to make that difference and ensure that as you work, you're at the center of the national development plans in countries, but you're also part of regional integration strategies. I can say a lot more, but I think my time is up, and there's an opportunity to talk again, and there's a lot more to be said. But we must be seen to be part of the infrastructure growth story. Women should be part of the productive sectors. When we talk about agriculture, we're not talking about changing the length of a hoe. Hoes belong in museums. We're talking about women being part of the agriculture global value chains. We must see women from the seed to the markets, and we must make that happen. And the ADB, along with the African Union and ECA, commits to make that difference. But we can only make that difference when everyone is part of it. Governments, the private sector, and civil society. It's got to be intergenerational, and it's got to involve boys and girls, men and women. We must leave no one behind. And post-2015 must have the space for women as required. I thank you.
Once an activist, always an activist. So whether it's in the South African government, in Dakar, Beijing, or at the Africa Development Bank, Ms. Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi has reminded us that the activist spirit has not died. We're hearing some very consistent messages this morning, making a difference for every woman, girl, boy, and man. And the powerful message from Dr. Kaberuka, gender is not an annex. It is not an add-on. You don't finish reading the book and at the end, there is something that says, for references to gender, 10 here. She has also reminded us, the question that is being asked, Africa is rising, but who is rising with it? Is the growth that we are experiencing inclusive enough? And the stubbornness, the pervasiveness of gender inequalities that Madam Puri also spoke about. And she has gone to the classic question, what is to be done? And there is a lot to be done. And she has challenged us. Did we all become a bit complacent? How did we monitor the progress? How did we hold the different sectors to account? Not only governments, but civil society, the private sector, including the African Development Bank, which made a pledge in 2000 about mainstreaming gender and supporting the Beijing Platform for Action. Have we scrutinized the activities of the African Development Bank to see how it is ensuring the realization of the commitments made? The Special Fund for Women, $10 million, the drop in the ocean. But now we have heard that the $300 million that is being raised, the pledges, 10% should go to women. Is it enough? We can ask. And Madam Moleketi has thrown a special challenge to the honorable ministers of gender here present, that actually you may be more powerful than you realize, and that you need to act differently, not to see yourselves as implementers of small projects for women, small loans, but to really place yourself within the sectors, the national development plans, the regional integration strategies, to aim high and to act as catalysts. Where are the growth sectors in our countries? How are we following it? Where are women and girls located in these growth sectors? So if we say that women are the backbone of agriculture, how are we ensuring that agricultural value chains really ensure women's growth, that women's enterprises are growing? And as she says, we're not just changing the length of the hose, but we're thinking about real machinery that increases productivity. Very thought-provoking, and she has reminded us that you can count on the partnership between the African Development Bank, the Economic Commission for Africa, and the African Union Commission as you go within your work. So let's thank her once again for her remarks. Now, we have come to the address by His Excellency Dr. Carlos Lopez, who does not need much introduction. Dr. Carlos Lopez is United Nations Under-Secretary General and Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, who has led a number of other institutions in the United Nations. Before coming to the ECA, he was the Executive Director of the United Nations Institute for Training and Research and Director of the United Nations System Staff College. His commitment to gender is demonstrated through his placing of gender as one of the key priorities at the ECA. And when he joined the ECA or assumed leadership of the ECA, he recognized the need for the ECA to provide critical and strategic support, as well as vital data and statistics to better inform policy development by African member states. He also recognized that at the center of development are women and girls, and placed the Africa Center for Gender within the Social Development Policy Division, and has strengthened the Africa Center for Statistics with a strong program on gender statistics. Dr. Lopez, I invite you to make your remarks.
Madame Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, présidente de la Commission de l'Union africaine, in absentia, mais ici représentée avec brio par l'ambassadeur Phoebe Potgieter, Madame Patricia Cagliati, ministre de la Condition féminine, de l'enfance, des personnes handicapées et du bien-être social de la République du Malawi, Madame Géraldine Fraser-Moleketi, envoyée spéciale de la Banque africaine de développement sur les questions du genre, Madame Lakshmi Puri, directrice exécutive adjointe de ONU Femmes, Mesdames les ministres, Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, la salle est pleine d'émotions. Bienvenue à la réunion ministérielle de la Conférence régionale africaine sur l'examen de Pékin +20. Et il suffit de dire que votre présence ici aujourd'hui reflète clairement l'engagement que nous avons pris de parvenir à l'égalité des sexes et à l'autonomisation des femmes en Afrique. Cette réunion nous offre également une tribune pour convenir d'une position africaine pour l'examen mondial du programme d'action de Pékin. Je tiens à souligner la coopération établie par la tenue de cette conférence avec la Commission de l'Union africaine et avec ONU Femmes, qui sont nos partenaires pour l'examen de Pékin+20. Et je remercie tous les autres fonds, institutions et programmes des Nations Unies pour leur honorable contribution. Je souhaite aussi saluer la présence de ma sœur, Gertrude Mongella, qui a conduit les consultations au niveau régional et international, ayant mené à la conférence de Pékin. Elle est la vraie héroïne de la journée. Considérée comme l'un des cadres normatifs les plus audacieux et les plus progressistes jamais adoptés pour accélérer la promotion des femmes et assurer l'égalité des sexes, le programme d'action de Pékin repose sur de nombreuses contributions émanant notamment du continent, telles que les stratégies prospectives de Nairobi pour la promotion de la femme ou la plateforme d'action de Dakar. Nous ne devons pas perdre de vue que l'égalité des sexes n'est pas un choix, mais un droit humain fondamental que nous devons préserver. Cela exige donc de mener cet examen avec courage. Comme à l'ACA, nous sommes plutôt des économistes, permettez-moi de souligner quelques faits. Ladies and gentlemen, Africa is on an encouraging pathway, translating some of Beijing's promises into actions. Today, more African women are literate than ever before, and more girls are attending school. Bold implementation of policies in some countries have gone a long way in increasing overall school enrollments and reducing gender differences. For instance, in the first year of eliminating school fees for primary education, enrollment in Malawi, and that's why the minister is here, rose by 68% and contributed to bringing in more girls than boys to school. Secondary education gender parity is being achieved in most Southern African countries. The greatest improvements are taking place in this area in West Africa, though. With regards to voice and agency, Africa has witnessed a gradual increase in the proportion of women in decision-making processes, particularly in national parliaments. Rwanda's 64% rate of women participation is a historical achievement. The country is ranked first in the world for this indicator. The example has been set for others to follow, and marked improvements are taking place. Since 2012, 7 African countries have at least 40% representation of female ministers, while 24 countries have between 10 and 20% of their parliamentary seats held by women. Cape Verde has more women ministers than men. Africa is proud of its prominent female leaders, such as Presidents Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and Catherine Samba-Panza, as well as former President Joyce Banda. Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma is also an inspiration to women everywhere. In the area of health, we have seen the rate of maternal mortality reduced by 47% from 1990 to 2013. Whilst we have cause to celebrate this significant reduction, the mortality rate remains high. The bottom line is that it is morally unacceptable in this day and age, with the advancement of science and medicine, to lose lives from preventable conditions. Reproductive and social health remains a cause for concern. We need to do more in this front as well. We have seen school life parity grow exponentially. However, only 12 out of 43 countries for which data is available had achieved total gender parity in secondary education enrollment. The gender parity index is higher amongst high-income groups. To address this inequality, there is an urgent need to deal with early marriages, the high cost and poor quality of education, as well as increase the chances and opportunities for women to attain tertiary and higher levels of education. It is only by nurturing the skills of young people, particularly girls, and investing in their education that the continent will be in a position to take advantage of a demographic dividend, a prelude to vastly improved livelihoods. Women still own as little as 25% of the land, despite being the backbone of the agricultural sector. We know too well what ownership of agricultural assets, such as land, increases agricultural outputs which have a critical impact on food security and self-sufficiency. This is essential in the rural areas where women represent half of the agricultural workforce, and in some countries more than that. FAO have found that closing the gender gap in agricultural inputs alone can lift up 150 million Africans out of hunger. Wage disparities between women and men remain extremely high. In some African countries, women earn less than 60% of what men earn for similar jobs. Disparities also exist when it comes to employment opportunities. For instance, in non-agricultural sector employment, the share of women's employment remains as low as 22% in Africa, compared to 37% in Latin America and the Caribbean, and 36% in East Asia. Despite their pivotal role in the economy, women are still not fully integrated in some of the most productive sectors, such as agribusiness or extractive industries. Our 2014 MDG report highlights that 1% increase in the gender gap in effective labor reduces the output per worker up to 0.49% in African countries. This translates to an annual economic loss exceeding 60 billion. That is as much as external aid. When it comes to the incidence of violence against women, we cannot afford to be defensive. It is a tragedy, and it points to a worrying trend. According to ECA, the incidence of violence against women in some African countries may be up to 5 times that of some developed economies. Equally disturbing is the mounting evidence that violence against women, where reported, may actually be increasing. It is estimated that the reported acts of violence cost between 1% and 12% of GDP. The monthly cost of violence against women is 20 times that of an average medical expenditure for a household. Ladies and gentlemen, over the 20 years since the inception of Beijing Action Platform, the global development context has changed. Africa is emerging as a pivotal region for global economic growth. This had been evidenced by the continent's robust growth performance, despite subdued global performance. Our continental growth has averaged about 5% over the last decade. Africa has not been capable of propelling strong transformation of its economic realities. Without jobs, inclusion, and social distribution, the good news are limited. We cannot build dynamic African countries if women and girls, who form the majority of the population, remain marginalized or excluded. Despite some of the strides made with regards to gender equality I just mentioned, and on empowerment of women, we still have a long way to go. Africa can and must do better. In this vein, ECA is implementing a continent-wide initiative for gender equality and women's empowerment, as endorsed by the Joint Conference of Ministers of Finance and Economic Development of the African Union and ECA in Abuja this year. It builds on three interlinked components, namely economic empowerment, women's human rights, and the social sector. The focus of interventions will support Africa's structural agenda, particularly women's socioeconomic bargaining power and their participation in structural transformation informed by in-depth research, data, and analysis. It is clear that we have unfinished business that requires us to build on the gains registered over the last 20 years. We have to come up with a more transformative framework that will accelerate the desired change in the lives of women and girls. Investing in women's education, health, property rights, access to and control over financial resources, knowledge and information, all are fundamental. The African Common Position on the post-2015 goals places gender equality squarely as one of the priorities for the continent. Ladies and gentlemen, time for token references on women empowerment and gender equality is over. Nobody should have been given the chance to get away with it in the first place. But unfortunately, it was tolerated for quite a long time. We have a chance to make a real difference. Building on the lot that has been achieved, let us recharge our batteries to continue the fight. Thank you, merci, obrigado, shukran.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lopez. Dr. Lopez has reminded us of the purpose of this meeting, which is to build an African position for the Beijing+20 review, and reiterated the importance of the Beijing Platform for Action as a trailblazer. Like other speakers, he has reminded us that gender equality is not an option, but a fundamental human right. He took us through some of the bold implementation of policies in some countries that has shown positive results, such as the elimination of school fees, the growth of secondary school enrollments for girls, particularly in Southern Africa, the exemplary situation when it comes to political participation of women in countries like Rwanda and Cape Verde, but also several other countries, reductions in maternal mortality rates, but still the too high rates that we still have. He noted that reproductive and sexual health of women and girls is still a cause for concern around Africa, as are the rates of early marriage, the high cost and poor quality of education. We talk a lot about the demographic dividend, but he has reminded us that this is something that will not happen automatically, and that we need to nurture the skills of young people, especially girls, to realize the demographic dividend. He highlighted the still very low land ownership rates of women and the links of this to agricultural productivity, and cited FAO findings on what closing the gender gap in agriculture could mean for drastically reducing poverty. He also emphasized wage and employment disparities for women and the need to integrate women and girls in agribusiness and extractive industries. He reminded us of the tragedy of violence against women and the socioeconomic costs of such violence, growing up to between 1% and 12% of GDP in many of our countries. He brought us back to the changes in the global context and the fact that African countries have registered growth whilst other countries have fallen into recession elsewhere. And yet, so long as we do not create jobs, ensure inclusion and social investments, we cannot move forward. And he closed by informing us of ECA's continent-wide initiative on women's empowerment and gender equality that looks at 3 sectors: economic empowerment, the social sector, and women's human rights. And although he did not say so, these are things that can be taken up with the ministries of finance in our countries, because they were presented to the ministers of finance and planning in Abuja in March. Dr. Lopez closed by reminding us that the time for token references to gender is over. Gender is not an annex. It is time to recommit. It is time for Africa to step forward and to show that what others have done, it can also do. This is the challenge for all of us at this meeting, and I would like us to applaud Dr. Lopez once again. Distinguished delegates, one of Africa's major successes and credit goes to our heads of state and government for appointing a woman to lead our key continental institution. As you will recall, the Beijing Platform for Action calls for women in key decision-making processes, and we are proud that the African Union Commission is led by a woman, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, who makes us think that maybe one day all those dreams that Nabila referred to in the poem will be realized. Unfortunately, Madam Zuma could not be here with us today, and I would like to invite Ambassador Phoebe Potiga Kubele, the special advisor to the chairperson, to introduce the special message from Her Excellency, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma.
Dr. Lopez, Executive Secretary of the UNECA, the Chairperson of the African Regional Conference, and Minister of Malawi, the UN Women Deputy Executive Director, the Special Advisor from the African Development Bank, Excellencies Ministers, Sisters, Excellencies, Gentlemen. The struggle for gender equality and women's empowerment remains at the core of the African Union's vision of building an integrated, prosperous, people-centered Africa at peace with itself. This is an agenda which Dr. Dlamini-Zuma has fought for all her life, and Beijing has certainly been one of the highlights of this experience under the leadership of veterans such as Mamongela and others that were part of the trenches during that historic conference. During a tenure as ministers in the Republic of South Africa, but as chairperson of the African Union Commission, it is an agenda that she has driven relentlessly. Whether it came to pushing for women at the table in peace talks around issues of sexual violence in conflicts, the rights of girl children, representation of women, the issues of health, women's health, and the fight against Ebola, economic empowerment of women, she is relentless about these issues, and in every single occasion have raised these questions and always ask the question, where are the women? What is the position of women within anything that we do, from agriculture to politics to peace to science and technology and all of the things that we're talking about. She therefore very deeply regrets that she is unable to be here today, but she is, and she's said that I must assure you that she is here with you in thoughts, in spirit, and look forward towards the outcome of this special meeting of the African Regional Conference on Beijing+20, because next year the African Union will be celebrating the theme Women's Empowerment for the Realization of Agenda 2063, and we hope that the action points arising from your declaration will help us to shift the agenda of women's empowerment on the continent through your practical suggestions. It is now my honor to introduce the message from Dr. Dlamini-Zuma on behalf of the African Union Commission. Thank you very much.
My dear brother Carlos Lopez, Executive Secretary of the UNECA and host of this meeting, leadership of the UN Women and the entire UN family, Mrs. Geraldine Fraser Muleketi of the African Development Bank and other members of the bank,
Ambassador Phoebe, we want to thank the chairperson through you for being with us in spirit. Thank you for reminding us also of the activist past and present of the chairperson and her demonstrated commitment to women. We heard it when she spoke about her vision for a non-sexist, prosperous, and integrated Africa. That is a very powerful statement. In her statement, she reminded us of the progress that we have made, but the challenges that remain, the importance or the imperative of the economic empowerment of women. She emphasized the rights of girl children and also mentioned the scourge of violence. These are all important issues that we know the ministers will be considering in their own deliberations. And as she has informed us, Ambassador Phoebe informed us, the declaration will serve as an important input into the summit that will be held next year. So on your behalf, I want to thank members of the High Table, the distinguished High Table, for being with us this morning, for delivering very critical messages, challenging us, asking us to move out of our comfort zones, to think big, to act differently, to recommit, and not to be complacent as we move, that what happens to women in Africa will inform very much what the global agenda on gender equality. And we know that as ministers of gender and women's affairs in your respective countries, you hold a lot of power, and that you will act to ensure that our deliberations don't just remain here in Addis Ababa, but are factored into the work that you do every day in your countries. So we would like to thank once again, please, let's thank the High Table